Most of my time is spent, my job is actually spent in thirds, and I've been getting this question a lot. About a third of my time is spent with enterprises in the States, talking about their web security challenges, what works, what doesn't work. Then going back to White Hat and building better products and services that might help solve their problems. And I guess what I'm best known for is breaking stuff and presenting about it and sharing what I learned back with the community at large, whatever it is related to web security. So I get to speak at a whole lot of conferences. Get a lot of press, which is cool. I was one of the authors who wrote the book on cross-site scripting, so that's a nice claim to fame. And before founding White Hat 10 years ago, literally this month, I was an information security officer at Yahoo. My job there was to hack every website that they had, preferably before the bad guys did. That worked for a while. And then later, what I learned there, I took to founding of White Hat to try to solve some really big web security problems, mostly that the web was really, really insecure. We knew there was vulnerabilities, but we just didn't know where exactly they were. So started out with White Hat to solve that larger problem, to be able to assess all the world's websites all at the same time and find all the issues relating with them. So I want to talk a lot about website security. And you're here, and I would imagine that web security is in all your best interests. It's in all the best interests of your friends, your family, our governments, and literally our way of life. We do everything online now. We bank, we shop, we pay bills, file taxes, you watch movies, you communicate with your friends, and everything. And there's three broad categories of attacker types, I guess if you want to call it, that put all those things in jeopardy. Cyber war, for those that like that term. There's cybercrime, which is different than cyber war, obviously, and then there's hacktivism. And they all have their different take on website security, but those are the threats that are out there. And they all seem to use very similar techniques to get their agenda done. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but basically, this is the cloud that we're familiar with. And to help web security, I think it's helpful to know and bring a statistical analysis point of view to the problem. We want to know how breaches are occurring, so how we best counteract them. That seemed like a logical approach. So I think we know a lot about this and how breaches happen. And I did see there was somebody, I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, that will be talking about the Verizon Data Breach Incident Report. For those that haven't read this, this is required reading for anybody in information security. And let me pick out some highlights. For those that are not familiar with this, the Verizon DBIR, it is a report on incident response. So Verizon has a team that responds to incidents. They do all their forensic analysis, who did it, what they got access to, when it, what happened, and everything about it. And they aggregate this data and they put it into a report. So it's a year lag. So this is a quote from the Verizon Data Breach Report from 2010, which reflects 2009 incidents. And here's the quote. The majority of breaches and almost all the data stolen in 2009, 95%, were perpetrated by remote organized criminal groups hacking servers and applications. That's code for hacking web servers and web applications. So that's where the bad guys are going after. That could have been an anomaly, and then the Verizon guys followed up very nicely the year after. And this, these reports, I'm not going to do them justice at all. There's like 80, 90 pages of good data. But the second one was, or at least the 2011 version, reflecting 2010 data, said the number of web application breaches increased last year and made up nearly 40% of the overall attacks. That's astounding. That's how we're getting compromised. So this is from breaches from 2009 and 2010. Obviously, we're in 2011. So that was before all this stuff. So all of these sites, all these companies and all these sites actually have all one thing in common. In the last year, all of them have their web presences, or at least one of them hacked to some degree. You might be familiar with, MySQL was hacked, SQL injection, Zynga, the CIA in the US, PBS, and who could forget Sony. Some are brand damage. Other ones have lost millions in the case of Citigroup. Massive business logic flaw related fraud there for compromising accounts, but all hacked. So we know a lot about this stuff. We know where the bad guys are going after, and we know the layer. So on all this stuff, as you might expect, I read all the news stories as I possibly can, and I put them out on my Twitter feed, the ones I find interesting. And I find a lot of the news reporting, a lot of the quotes by the experts, I simply do not agree with. The things that we should be learning are, and I'll go through the list, is that each and every one of these breaches could happen to any online business. Nothing makes any of those, to the best of my knowledge, nothing had made any one of those companies different than the rest, including Sony. I don't really believe that Sony was less secure than any other one of those particular companies. But imagine yourself, you having to protect 500 websites, 1,000 websites, and only 20 got compromised after a targeted attack. Actually, you might be doing pretty good, relatively speaking. I haven't found anything of these attacks that, again, that make these companies different. So this could happen to anybody. Exploitation of just one website vulnerability is enough to cause all these attacks. Just one SQL injection, just one business logic flaw, just one PHP local file include attack, and that's it. No more firewalls, intrusion detection systems. All it takes is one, and that's extremely problematic from a software development lifecycle point of view, and I'll get to that. Why? So I also do a top 10 web hacking techniques each year to show all the different web hacking techniques, and there's dozens every year. But it seems all the bad guys gravitate to a few different types of attacks because that's really all they need. They have SQL injection, right? Right through the web browser, direct database access to extract data or to root the machine. Very similar in the way it sets up. You have PHP file include attacks. If there's a PHP website, no problem. It was speculated. What was the last site that just got compromised? It was a major site. I'm blanking on it now. I think it was a gaming site or something. They extract all this data. Sometimes it's credit card number, sometimes it's bank details, personal information, but other times it's usernames and passwords, hashed or otherwise. Now, here's the thing. So as security experts, we tell users to choose hard-to-guess passwords and a different password on each individual website. Right? So that causes them to write them down. When they don't write them down, they'll actually reuse the same password on multiple websites. So the bad guys, to compromise other websites, will reuse passwords across multiple websites. For whatever reason, if they can't hack the site directly in a given amount of time, they will DOS it. And if they can compromise it, they're fully capable of putting malware on it to infect the users of the website. So the website is just a conduit. If you look closely, and I'm preaching to the choir here, none of these attacks are going to be defended against by buying more firewalls and SSL. Right? Not a single one of them. What I do think makes these incidents unique is that, and why they keep occurring, is that the bad guys are starting to target their victims, whether it's Sony or the CIA or the Oakland police. So bad guys are starting to target it. Now, I mentioned it takes just one vulnerability, and this is where it gets problematic. It's very difficult, if not provably impossible, to create bug-free code. And if it just takes one, that's a problem. So I've heard the corollary that said, and I do happen to agree with this, that a good software development lifecycle should not necessarily try to eliminate exploitable vulns, but should be to reduce, not necessarily eliminate, the number of vulnerabilities introduced and the severity of those that remain. So it's kind of a race. You can't get to zero, but you can make the difficulty of finding that one harder to a reasonable degree. But we don't know how to measure secure enough or what secure enough is. So a lot of these incidents, our customers read this stuff and they freak out and they go, well, what do we do to protect ourselves? How do we start this web security program? And to kick off, I actually just tell them one thing. The bad guys are going to do this stuff, so where you begin is you hack yourself first. The bad guys are going to try it, so you might want to know what they know or will eventually. And that's where White Hat comes in. We are I guess without giving the 30-second sales pitch, we're the software as a service platform for doing website vulnerability assessments. And I'll get to some of the statistics, but our customers have us assess their websites all the time using a combination of humans and technology. I won't go too deeply into it, but let me tell you some statistics from the data set I'm going to derive from. So the title is a little bit misleading. It's 4 years. It's actually more like 5 years and 4,500 websites. It's roughly 200 terabytes worth of data that I'm pulling from now. So the set is over 400 enterprises. These are US-based companies, so I do not know the metrics for Australia, but maybe you guys are somewhat like us here, so draw your own conclusions. I don't know. I don't have enough sites in the sample set, but these are US-based companies, about 98% of them, about 4,500 sites. These sites are going to be the most important ones. You're not going to pay us to assess a site that you don't care about the security of. So these are going to be large banks, financial institutions, insurance, retail companies, energy companies. I guarantee you, have accounts on these systems. And there's a lot of confidential data here. So it's about 4,500 sites. We process about 350,000 vulnerabilities per day. We send well in excess of 600 million requests per month. We're massive crawlers, and we're logging about 10 terabytes of data per week. So the data set we have is massive, the largest to my knowledge in the space. So let me get to some data. So part of our service is we assess websites week in and week out, and the same ones week in, week out. So we get to know over a given amount of time how many vulnerabilities are introduced. So if you look at a website, it is not a static piece of software. It's software that drives a business, and the business never sleeps. So the bad guys have a 24/7 by 365 window of opportunity to get into the website. So it's an inaccurate measure to go, if it's on day 1, January 1st, right? And you know how many vulnerabilities are that day. The point in time is not good enough because these websites are living. They're changing code all the time. So this is the average annual amount of new serious vulnerabilities introduced per website per year. Let me parse this out a little bit. So what's serious? Serious, if you want to go by PCI conventions, it's anything that's rated high, critical, or urgent. You are not PCI compliant with any one of these issues. Probably a better way to describe it, you will make front page news with these, should the media choose to. Customer data loss, system compromise, disruption of the system. So these are the ones you really should fix. So starting off in 2007, the average website we were testing had over 1,100 vulnerabilities on them. I should also mention how we count vulnerabilities. So website login.asp, let's say it has 5 parameters, 3 of which are vulnerable to SQL injection. We count that as 3, not 1. So that's kind of how we count. So it's a little bit of an exploded view. In 2008, the number dropped to 800. In 2009, just under 500. In 2010, 230. This year, right now, the average seems to be right around 150 or so in 2011. It's not quite over yet, but it doesn't seem the numbers will change all that much. So even in 2011, this might be the first bit of good news that web security has ever seen. Things are starting to get less vulnerable. It's still 10 vulnerabilities per month, and the bad guy just needs 1, but it seems to be getting better. So that's broad averages. What's interesting is when you start slicing the data up by industry. So these are 2010. This is 2010 data. I'm working on 2011 data now. It's going to have even more industry verticals in it. So I mentioned the overall was 230 different vulns per year. If you look at the differences between, let's say, banking, healthcare, and manufacturing, they have the least amount of vulnerabilities per year. Now, there is a difference between banking and financial services in the teal color. Banking this is self-selecting, so customers go into the interface and they go, I am a bank, or I am a financial services company. This would be the difference between Bank of America and S1 or Fiserv. This is the hosting provider for banks, if you want to think of it that way. They might have the same types of websites, checking account websites, savings account websites, same types of apps, but 2 different types of companies. But if you look at the difference between them, the service providers do way, way worse security-wise than the banks themselves do. The other thing to note is that if you look at least the banking and healthcare, the regulated industries, government-regulated industries tend to do better security-wise versus the industry-regulated ones, such as retail, actually perform the worst overall at over 400 vulnerabilities. That's PCI territory. So a lot of people like to rail on PCI. I tend to be one of them. If PCI is making a difference, I can't see it in my data. What else can I say about this particular bit of data? These numbers are, let me go on to the next slide here. These numbers are getting better over time. This is not a very good way to visualize the data, but those are the industries. The bottom is the years. And if you notice, if you start looking at it slowly, there's some anomalies probably in the data set a little bit, maybe sampling bias. But overall, it seems the numbers are improving year over year across all verticals to different degrees. The number of vulnerabilities that are being discovered is dropping. So it seems like software is getting better on the web. So that's a good thing. So I've given you totals. I'd also like to give you more about what types of issues are most common, let's say prevalence. So this is our top 10 for 2010, and our top 10s are a little bit different in the way we capture it. Sometimes websites will literally have hundreds of cross-site scripting vulns, other ones have 1, so broad averages on class is not very helpful from an average standpoint. So the way we measure it is, let's say you take the blue tall bar there. 64% of the sites we tested in 2010 had at least one issue of information leakage, at least one instance. They could have had 10, they could have had 2, but they had at least one. Another 64% had cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, at least one instance. That number is dropping. Actually, cross-site scripting, we're finding less and less by percentage. Maybe per year, probably 5% less per year. 5% fewer sites have at least one instance. It's not to say that they never had one before, but they're starting to have them less and less now. It's the first time in the last 5 years that cross-site scripting has not been number one. It actually dropped below information leakage by 0.2. Information leakage is kind of like a catch-all between the website is leaking internal IP addresses, database locations, developer notes. Sometimes we find, if you view source on the web page, you'll find usernames and passwords for backend databases and things like that. Then you start going down the range a little bit. I should point out some things like cross-site request forgery. I'd imagine most in the audience here is fairly familiar with cross-site scripting and its effects, but fewer still know what cross-site request forgery is. Cross-site request forgery, as far as awareness goes, is probably where cross-site scripting was 5 years ago. If you're at all interested in web security, if you're at all interested in web security, this is the one you need to learn about. This is the one that's killing a lot of sites right here. It's an artifact of the web. So this is just to give you a taste of what it is for those that don't know. It's a way to force the user to make a web request that they didn't intend to make. So if you logged into your web bank at some point during the day, your browser is logged in, and you leave your bank where you're still logged in, and if you go to my blog and I force you to make a request to your bank to wire transfer money, it was your browser, you were logged in, you made a valid request, just not one that was intended. So technically speaking, every feature of every website is a candidate for cross-site request forgery, just some are more severe than others. The other gotcha of cross-site request forgery is the entire industry is terrible for scanning for this one. Absolutely horrid. So that number, 24%, is wildly inaccurate. The real number is probably more like 80%, just to different degrees of severity. 24 represents the vulnerabilities of the worst that we're deciding to push now, because a lot of our customers, even the most mature customers, don't consider this a vulnerability, at least not one that belongs to them. It belongs to the internet. Some of the other ones here, you'll see SQL injection at 14%. Some of the other business logic ones like insufficient authorization and maybe abusive functionality at 14 and 10% respectively. If you take a step back, about half of these classes you can automate fairly reliably. The other half you can't. We can automate cross-site scripting, content spoofing, SQL injection fairly reliably, but abusive functionality, insufficient authorization, cross-site request forgery, we really can't. So as we say in web security, you can't really scan. Scanning a website is not nearly enough if you plan to have a comprehensive assessment. So that's broad industry. One of the questions we get is, are different industries suffering from different types of issues? And we don't see it in the data, which would make sense. Everybody is developing with the same web servers, with the same programming languages, the same development frameworks, with you reading the same books. We all deal with the exact same problems in the exact same technologies. The difference is in degree. Different industries seem to suffer from different volumes of those issues than other ones. So the way to read this slide is 43% of the banks that we tested in 2010 had at least one instance of cross-site scripting, versus 75% of the telecommunication sites had at least one instance, 72% of the social networking websites. And you'll see pinks in there, which are the SQL injections. You'll see cross-site request forgery, which are the yellows. One of the interesting ones that stood out to me is that if you notice, these are a top 7, so it stops at a certain point. Like in telecom, 25%, it stops there, which means there's a ton of other ones in there that are still percentage-wise important. But notice the banking sector on the left. It stops at 10, and there's no pinks. The bank, less than 10 I had to look it up. We found at least one instance of SQL injection on about 7% of the banking websites. So probably by sheer force, the bad guys going after these sites mercilessly, the organizations had to went after it and try to exterminate SQL injections to the best that they could. What's interesting about that is that when web security gets better, it happens on a class-by-class basis, not on a severity-by-severity basis, and it doesn't happen uniformly. At some point, a company says, I really don't like cross-site scripting, and they go after it. I really don't like SQL injection, and they go after it. They don't handle the whole thing all at once. It's just a characteristic that we're seeing across the industry. Now, so I've shown you volume and type. But we want to somehow capture the security of a website, how secure different websites are, and have metrics around it. So I think the security posture of a website must take into account remediation rates and time to fix metrics. Living, breathing websites that are changing. These are operational businesses. So we developed this metric called window of exposure, and this was quite sobering, actually. This is 2010 numbers. What is window of exposure? It's the number of days in a year a website is exposed to at least one seriously reported vulnerability. Remember I said before, it just takes one vulnerability to give you a really bad day? I wanted to know how many days you could have been given a really bad day. So I know it's a little hard to read here. The red here, those are always vulnerable every single day of the year. So 44% of the sites that we looked at in 2010 had at least one serious security vulnerability literally every single day of 2010. It might have been SQL injection, it might have been a PHP file include, it might have been a CSRF, but literally every single day, bad guy goes to the website, they will find something. If you add in the oranges, which is 9 months or more, 68% of websites that we tested in 2010 had at least one serious vulnerability or near to it. So those are the red and oranges are bad. The green and light greens are good. So if you look at all the way down at the bottom there on the banking sector, 51% of the banking websites we tested in 2010 were vulnerable less than 30 days of the year. They're clearly doing something right. We don't know what it is exactly, but we want to learn from them. So when we start learning and wanting to improve web security, we wanted to slice it and find out who are the secure websites and the companies that are doing better and figure out their characteristics so we can start teaching the guys in the red and orange. You know, what makes what's the difference in the posture, policies, activities between the educational sector and the banking sector, because there's clearly something massive in there. Quite interesting, isn't it? It's kind of spooky. So I'm waiting for the 2011 to close, and then I'll count 2011. Now, I mentioned before, as part of the service, we're assessing all the time. So when we find an issue, we find it, we say, we found cross-site scripting in this parameter on this website. This is how bad it is. This is what it can do. This is how to replicate it. This is how to fix it. Customer goes and codes up a fix, QAs it, pushes it to production, and then we retest it. Between discovery and resolution, there's a time to fix metric that we can measure. So I'll give you time to fix. So let me describe how this works. On the horizontal is the number of days on the average it takes to fix a vulnerability in real terms. On the horizontal is a cumulative website percentage. So if you follow the black line, which is everybody on aggregate, and you follow up to the 50% mark and you draw a line down, you'll find that it takes, on average, a company 100 days to fix a reported serious vulnerability. You ever go across those company policies that say you will fix all your serious vulnerabilities in 30 days, 45 days, 2 months, right? If you just want to be better than average, it's 100 days. That's it. That's 100 days to fix an issue. But it does differ across the range. If you see the banking sector in red, if you follow it up to the 50% mark, it drops down into about a month. If you're a bank and you want to do better than average, you fix your high severity vulnerabilities in under a month. That's all you have to do is under a month, which is easier said than done a lot of times because the banking sectors, they only change like, 2-3 times a year on the average, while the retail guys have more opportunity. Now, I wish I could tell you that all vulnerabilities that we find get fixed. You only get a time to fix when issues are fixed. Which brings us to remediation rates. So this is our remediation rates overall, separated by industry, starting in October of 2007, all the way up to about August 2011. This is the second bit of good news that we saw in web security. On the average, we're seeing a 5% increase in the total amount of vulnerabilities being remediated year over year. Right now, it hovers at about 53-54% on average. So just over half of the vulnerabilities that we're finding are getting fixed. So that's promising. Different industries do better than others. You see the banking sector and the retail sector have better remediation rates. We actually find this pretty interesting. The retail sector guys have a lot of vulnerabilities. Banking sector don't have so many. But the retail guys, as far as right now goes, are actually fixing a higher percentage of their vulns than the banks. That might be a PCI artifact. So the big question is, why do vulnerabilities go unfixed? So I have this conversation a lot with a whole sorts of companies. Why aren't you fixing these? We're finding these for you. You're paying us to find them. You might want to fix them. And they give me all sorts of reasons. And some of these might be familiar to one or more of you. One of them is no one at the organization understands or is responsible for maintaining the code. Happens, I guess. The development group does not understand or respect the vulnerability. They don't know what SQL injection is. They don't know what cross-site request forgery is or cross-site scripting is. They have to be taught, because if they don't understand or respect it, there's no reason for them to fix it. There's lack of budget to fix the issues. Development resources are scarce. The affected code is owned by an unresponsive third-party vendor. The website will be decommissioned or replaced soon. We have sites in that state for over 2 years now. Risk of exploitation is accepted. I've always had to figure that one out, okay. One of my personal favorites, solution conflicts with business use case. It's also known as a feature. You will literally find SQL where as a parameter name. Compliance does not require fixing the issue. Yes, this happens. So when the OS top 10 changes, this has a dramatic impact on what gets fixed. And the one that's the most troubling, the most challenging, and should be the most interesting to academia is this last one here. Feature enhancements are prioritized ahead of security fixes. This is the one I spent a lot of time thinking about, and talking to a lot of people about. When you find a host or network level vulnerability that's patchable by Microsoft, a CVE-related vulnerability, and that's something I didn't make clear. Each and every one of these vulnerabilities we're finding is vulnerabilities in a custom web application. They don't have CVE numbers. These are Bank A's vulnerabilities or retail site B's vulnerabilities. So there is no patch. So we work for security. Security gives this knowledge over to the CIO, which relays it down to the development manager, and they may or may not fix it. So there's this up and down sequence that goes on here. So IT cannot handle this themselves. They have to rely on the development group's resources. So what happens is that from the business perspective, the choice is, since development resources are scarce, do you allocate development resources to continue to code a revenue-generating feature that if you don't ship, will for a fact cost the business money? That's choice A. And choice B is, or do you take those development resources to fix one of these issues that may get exploited and may cost you money? You see the challenge there from a business standpoint? Which one do you do? It's an unknown versus a known. When do you make that choice? And the challenge is it's kind of rooted in economics. We have incomplete data to make this decision. And I don't know if we have a whole lot of InfoSec expertise to look at the economics, the business realities, the risk equations to make that conscious choice. So they go with what they know. They don't allocate those resources unless they absolutely have to by compliance, and they continue coding features and let the vulnerabilities sit. If we could figure out a way to solve that problem and give the business a logical way to make a decision and to prove it somewhat, we make a fundamental advancement in computer science and computer security. That's the one I work on a lot. One of the things that I have found helps out a lot is testing speed and frequency. We found this we found this over the last 2 years, that let's say you take developer A, and he's writing code, and he introduces a block of code that's vulnerable to SQL injection. If we find the SQL injection vulnerability and give him the results within a week of him developing that code, he can actually fix that vulnerability in less than an hour's work, because he's already working on that code, he's familiar with the code base, he's already tasked on that particular project, and everything's fine. 1 week is the best window. If, however, we take the same developer, same code block, same vulnerability, but we don't report it to him for a month, it actually takes them 1 to 3 hours, and they feasibly lose a day of productivity because they're no longer on that project. They're on a different feature, a different part of the site. They don't have the code trees up. They have to recheck everything out. It's much, much more work. So it goes from an hour or 15 minutes to multiple hours or a day. Anything after a month up to a year or more, it's multiple days. And it's actually not the same developer who fixes the code, because the code is now in maintenance mode. You have to get a different developer, find the source code, load up the trees, create the fix, and learn all this stuff. So what we find is that if the testing process is fast and in sync with the development life cycle, you get much better results. Same testing process, it just has to be timed better. So we know all these things about web security. We know how websites get hacked, how companies get hacked. We know the techniques. We know the vulnerabilities. We know what we're dealing with. So the big question becomes, the one I get asked by the media and others, is why do breaches and vulnerabilities continue to happen? If I ask, member of the audience here, let's try it. SQL injection. Who can give me one solution to SQL injection? Don't use SQL. Okay. You got me there. Who's got another one? I'm sorry? Escape inputs. Good. Another one? Anyone? Prepared statements. Okay, good. Cross-site scripting. Probably all the same ones. That, maybe not prepared statements, but then you have output filtering, right? You intrinsically know the solutions to all the ones I showed you. There's no magic in there. These are SQL injections 10 years old. Cross-site scripting is just as old. Cross-site request forage is a little weird, but we know how to fix those. There's nothing new here. So I think we know a lot about this problem, but so I cannot say that I think the answer to this problem is technical in nature. It's something else entirely. It might be cultural. So I want to play a game, the IT budget game. And this works in the US. I don't know it works in Australia, so I'm kind of going out on a limb here. So let's say you take the whole IT budget. IT develops business assets that the business finds valuable. They build software, they build systems to drive business. So you take this gigantic IT budget, and let's say you ask the CFO at those companies, the chief financial officer, to parcel up where the business invests their IT dollars. And you separate it into the network segment. Network is, let's say, routers and switches and network admins to manage it all. And you have the hosts, different bucket, that's servers, desktops, laptops, and the admins for that. And then you have the applications, the software that you buy, the software that you make, the people you have develop it, all your developers, CRM and ERP. From your experience, who gets the most money out of the IT budget? Does that include wages for each town? I'm sorry, yeah. Does that include wages? Yes, it's still IT dollars. So who gets the most money in IT? What bucket? So applications, so maybe it's different in Australia. I don't know. At least in the US, it's applications, because you think eBay and PayPal, and actually I had a conversation with a large bank in Chicago, and they actually said they had more software developers than Microsoft. That's real. So if you count all the developers and all the software, applications, at least in the US, again, it might be different here, most of it goes to applications, followed by the host that they set on, followed by the network, the routers and stuff that connects it all together. That's about right. Again, it might be different country by country. At least like that. Now, if you go to the CSO and you play the same exercise, you ask the chief security officer how they budget their money. You take the IT, their portion of the IT security budget, and they go, you are going to defend the business assets that we're investing IT dollars in. You take the same buckets, network, they buy firewalls, network IDS, SSL, monitoring, protecting the host, they do vulnerability management, patch management, and on the applications, they do software architecture, training, and testing. From your experience here, what bucket gets the most IT security dollars? Oh, followed by? And? Okay. Okay, cool. It worked in Australia. All right. All right. So we played both sides of the game, IT versus IT security, and so we started lining it up. Right? And it seems about 180 degrees out of phase to me. We spend the most IT security dollars, what we spend the least in IT dollars. We spend the least securing what the business spends the most on securing. Now, there's all different kinds of theories on why this happens. It might be because information security just happened to start in network land before software became big. CISOs just happen to have a network security background and not a software background, so they kind of have the run home to mama thing. We're just going to buy firewalls because that's what we've always done. There's an intrinsic race to firewalls and more antivirus and things like that, as if it's going to work. But it's 180 degrees out of phase. I think the biggest line item in non-security spending should match the biggest line item in security, but that's me. So what's my empirical data on this stuff other than this ad hoc game here? I found a survey here. The survey was from 2010 of IT pros and C-level executives from 450 of the Fortune 1000 companies. It was commissioned by Fishnet Security. Let me read this one verbatim for you here. Nearly 70% of those surveyed said mobile computing, social networking, and cloud computing platforms were, they thought, the biggest threats to security today. That's what they said they are most concerned about. I would imagine that's what they would say today in 2011, right? I read the rest of the report, and this is what I saw. 45% of the same people said their major purchases were going to be firewalls, antivirus, and authentication and anti-malware tools. Please tell me which one of these security controls is going to protect mobile computing and cloud computing platforms. Do you see the disconnect there? We're spending exactly in the places that we're not defending. They're not spending to protect the things that they just said they were most concerned about. Stuck in the 90s. I could be. So, again, just to give you more anecdotal data on this stuff, market sizing estimates for network security range anywhere from $5 to $8 billion, whereas the calculation, at least according to this analyst here, for application security market is about 440 million. So application security, where we're getting all the attacks, where we have all the vulnerabilities, where we're suffering all the losses measurably, is 10% of network security. That might be why we're losing. That might be why we'll continue to lose until we get some religion here, other than data. So fortunately, the same report did say that we expect the revenue of this sector to grow about 23% per year to reach $1 billion by 2014. So by 2014, it will be 20% of the network security space. Here's the challenge. If you're a CIO or a CISO trying to look at this problem, you're faced with some difficult choices. Let's just say the CISO for our purposes here. You can, one, decide to reallocate resources away from firewalls and IDS and antivirus towards application security. It's going to be it's a tough sell. Basically, you're going to try to convince the CISO, to go, you shouldn't buy as many firewalls. You should do this application security stuff. That's kind of a difficult sell, especially when it's exacerbated by compliance. You can't not buy AV. You can't not buy firewalls. You can't not buy traditional patch management. We cannot try different security strategies a lot of times because the CISO's hands are tied by compliance. Compliance might be forcing us into this particular problem here just by industry regulation, and we have no way out. I hope that's not true, but that it could in fact be the case. This is especially problematic in the US because our economy is not doing particularly well. You can try to justify brand new application security spending. The CISO can try to ask the CIO and the CFO for more money. After spending all these dollars on security and you're still getting owned, to try to ask for more money is going to be difficult at best. Might be similar here, or maybe not as bad considering. Or you can try number 3. You can, door number 3, Alex. Keep the status quo, breaches continue, and will get worse. Every year, our reliance on the web and services on the web will get more. More and more people. I think the stat is 2 billion people are now online. 2 billion people have a browser. 2 billion people are using web services, and they're connecting SCADA networks to it. I think the last one is somebody just hacked it. I don't know if it was over the web, but somebody just hacked a water station and caused one of the pumps to crash. So these are the things we have to look forward to. But lest we lose sight of this, we know that security is optional, but then again, so is survival. But I think this is the challenge here. We know a lot about the problem. We would need to be justifying our spending a little bit better, taking a step back and looking at it, what's working, what's not working. And what I'm going to start to do over time is start to better measure what makes these web security programs work better. We're very good outcome-based metrics. We know what happens, but not exactly why. So we would like to know better, if they did developer training, if it works. If it does work, how well does it work and in what circumstances? If source code reviews are the way to go, if different frameworks are performing better than others. So we're going to start learning more and more about this problem. I think this is the only way that I can justify anything that I say is with metrics to back it up. So if anybody has any questions, I can take them now, but hopefully this was informative. I know I landed up way early, but couldn't be helped. Any questions?
Any questions? Anyone?
Going back to your comment about hack yourself first, I think we're seeing in universities, some universities adopting where they actually teach developers how to hack. Have you seen any statistics or research, or have you done any yourself, where developers on websites that have gone through an education where they've learned how to hack, are they more effective at defending their websites and what they develop than developers who got no hacking education at all?
I've never done a binary analysis of that, what happens when some get training and some don't. But what I found, at least anecdotally from my experience, is that when I'm asked to do that, I'll train the developers on how to hack, SQL injection and cross-site scripting and whatever else for an hour, at least enough to get them extremely paranoid, and then no more attack data for them. What I find is that the scope of knowledge for attack-based web security stuff is rather vast, but defense is rather easy. There's only about 4 or 5 things you have to know to defend against 90% of the attacks. This is input validation. This is prepared statements. This is this and this, that. You go over 5 domains of knowledge, and they can wipe out most of the vulns. So I prefer to spend an hour to make them paranoid and a week on the defense stuff once they know why. If you just go straight to defense, they won't know, and they won't care. But beyond that, I have found, at least anecdotally, other companies, Google, Facebook, and now Mozilla, are paying people for exploits on their websites. They're actually taking a proactive role. They're asking people to hack them and pay them money as a result. And I'm thinking that's going to be one way we get out of this mess, is for that maturity to happen, because we don't simply have enough attackers anymore. We've actually run out of people that are attacking. If you take the entire pen test industry, it's going to be 2,000 to 3,000, maybe 5,000 at the most, and there's about 2 to 3 million new websites that go up every single month. So if you got to think about that a little bit. And the other thing that was interesting, when I looked at the bounty programs, it's the same people finding vulnerabilities across bounty programs. So there isn't a big pool of people that can actually do this work. It's actually quite interesting.
Hi, I just got a question. Have you ever looked into industrial networks vulnerabilities?
What's industrial? What do you mean?
Such as your electricity network, gas, water networks?
So to us, these are all websites. If they happen to be an energy website, it's fine. We do have energy in the set, but not enough for representatives, so I couldn't put it into the data set. We do have some government, energy, nonprofit, but not enough for me to make any good judgments about them. So,
thank you.
There's a gentleman back there.
Do you have any more? Okay.
I'm curious, have you overlaid any of the data that you showed with the actual age of the site? Because like you said, we've known about SQL injection for 10 years. It's almost like you have to purposefully try and create one these days. So how much of this is just legacy code that's showing up in the data?
Very astute. That's one of my theories I hope to prove or disprove. I think what a site is vulnerable to and how many vulnerabilities it has much to do with when the website was launched than anything else, because developers don't code against a vulnerability that they both don't know and respect, and that happens around a date, not a framework. So I think after 2005, after the SAMI worm, you'll probably see a noticeable drop-off in the number of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities on a per-site basis. After 2007, when the mass SQL injection worms broke out, you'll probably see a reduction in SQL injection. Right now I'm having difficulty finding age of website to do the overlay, but it's something I'd very much like to do, and because I think your intuition is probably right on.
How many of the websites in your pool have been there for the entire time? I guess what I'm getting at is they've gone from thousands down to just a few hundred, but is that because of your input or because the sites are getting better independently?
I like to think so. And next report I'm going to try to put out in December. Rather than going trending by calendar year, I'm going to trend by service time, so match the year 1 sites versus the year 2 sites and 3 sites, and I'm hoping the metrics will be good. Otherwise, I got problems. But yeah, that's something I want to see. But I think it might have a lot of times to grind through the site multiple times and they figure it out finally.
Okay, we've got 2 more here.
Sure.
Hi, Jeremiah.
Hi.
What do you think the current status of security awareness is in the developer community? I'm always amazed when I talk to developers and they've never heard of OWASP or, input validation or any of the attacks.
Awareness is getting better, but it's by no means good. Maybe it's 1 in 100 have done any. They'll probably have years and years of security knowledge, but less than hours of professional instructor-led security education. And you got to think about it from their perspective. If they learn security, do they make more money? Nope. If their code is the reason why Sony went down, do they get fired or penalized in some way? Nope. So the question is, why is it in their best interest to learn any of this stuff, to do any of these things? I think it's got to be a top-down driven exercise. The business has to care, and then the developers will care. I have come across organizations where the developers group's bonuses are tied to security performance of the website, and that seems to work well. The other one that seems to work well is a notion of competition between business units. So one of our customers taught us this. They were taking our reports and separating by business units and publishing the metrics internally. They would compare the business units against each other, vulnerability rates, time to fix metrics, and no one wanted to be the low guy on the totem pole. So they would start calling us and going, so how do we get these numbers better because this other group is doing better? So it could be they're outsourced, but there has to be a reason for developers to do this stuff. Otherwise, they won't. They'd rather create the next open WebGL game.
We've got 2 last questions.
Hello, Jeremiah. Thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to point out a recent case in Australia, the case of Patrick Webster, who discovered a flaw in First State Super. I don't know if you're familiar with that case.
I did read about it, yes.
Yes. The fact is the Australian legislation does not distinguish between good Samaritans and hackers. So by confirming the existence, technically you have committed a crime and the law has not been amended. So there is little incentive for people to report flaws, lest they be accused of committing a crime, and that's what they did to Patrick Webster. They suggested in their communication that he had created a flaw that did not exist, when in fact it was a blatant, obvious flaw that any first grade student could think of. And although they said, they're not going to prosecute him, what a great favour, the fact is I think people are now going to be reluctant to report these kind of flaws, lest, their time get wasted or they get inappropriately threatened.
Sure.
And I just think that international criminals will exploit the lack of good Samaritan laws and mechanisms for reporting security flaws.
Yeah. It's a chilling effect, absolutely. It also reminds me of several years ago, Daniel Cuthbert, also a member of OWASP out of the UK, who suffered the same kind of things. So it means when you go after good Samaritans in that way, you do have a chilling effect, and that means only the bad guys can go after and attack the websites. So I don't think that's what they had in mind, but it's just basically ignorance that causes that. But you do see, like I mentioned before, the completely opposite. You have companies like eBay, Microsoft, and PayPal, Firefox, Mozilla, Google, and welcoming people in and promising not to prosecute them if they just report the vulnerability. And I think that fosters better web security than anything else. If we just want the bad guys to attack us, I guess maybe that's their prerogative.
Hi, Jeremiah. Just with your sample set, what was the average size of the companies that you have in that statistics you're going with there?
It spanned the range from startups to Fortune 500 companies. 25% you might classify as SME that are under $500 million in revenue. The rest are going to be over that particular benchmark. I have, in earlier reports, I did try to find out closer what makes a secure website versus not. So I did slice by organizational size, and I ruled that out as an indicator. Some companies care, other ones don't. So size of company didn't seem to matter. I also sliced it in another report by programming language and framework. I did not find a big differentiator between .NET, Java, PHP, and Perl. I did see that .NET and Java had 20% fewer vulnerabilities on the average than the other languages. But what's interesting is that the Perl and PHP guys fixed a larger volume of their vulnerabilities faster than the other guys. But overall, it was kind of a wash.
Cool. I think that's about it. Can I have a good round of applause?
Thank you very much, everybody.